The classroom door swung open on a cold November morning in 1944, and the world, as everyone knew it, seemed to stop. Parents who had arrived early to drop off their children stood frozen in the hallway, their faces draining of color as they witnessed something that defied every instinct of wartime America. Inside the modest schoolroom of Riverside Elementary in rural Wisconsin, their sons and daughters sat at wooden desks, pencils in hand, learning mathematics from men wearing the unmistakable uniform of German prisoners of war. The eagle insignia, though stripped of its swastika, was still visible on faded gray-green fabric, enemy soldiers in their children's classroom, teaching them. One mother's scream shattered the silence. Within hours, the entire town would be ablaze with fury, demanding the arrest of the woman who had orchestrated this unthinkable act. But in that frozen moment, 32 students sat quietly, listening as a young German prisoner named Hans Müller carefully pronounced English numbers on the chalkboard, his accent thick but his demeanor gentle, almost professorial. The teacher who had brought him there, a 41-year-old woman named Catherine Mitchell, stood beside him with her chin raised and her hands steady, even as she saw the horror dawning on the faces of parents in the doorway. She had known this moment would come. She had prepared for it. What she could not have predicted was what her students would do when the entire community rose up to destroy her. But to understand how Catherine Mitchell made the most controversial decision of her teaching career, you must first understand the world she lived in. A world where every family had skin in the game, where hatred of the enemy was not just encouraged but expected, where questioning the narrative of good versus evil could mark you as a traitor. Riverside, Wisconsin, was a town of fewer than 3,000 souls, nestled along the banks of the Mississippi River, surrounded by dairy farms and cornfields that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where church attendance on Sunday was not optional, and where the 4th of July parade was the highlight of the year. Before the war, it had been peaceful, predictable, and proud. Then came December 7th, 1941, and everything changed. By the autumn of 1944, Riverside had sent 217 of its young men overseas. 17 had already died. Their names were read aloud at every town gathering, printed in the weekly newspaper, whispered in prayers at St. Mary's Catholic Church and First Lutheran alike. Gold star flags hung in windows throughout town, those heartbreaking banners that announced a family's ultimate sacrifice. Mothers who had lost sons moved through the streets like ghosts, their grief so heavy it seemed to bend the very air around them. Rationing had become a way of life. Sugar, butter, coffee, meat, all were scarce. Women saved bacon grease in tin cans for the war effort. Children collected scrap metal. Victory gardens sprouted in every backyard. The war was not some distant abstraction. It was present in every meal, every absence, every anxious wait for letters from the front. And with that constant presence came a sustained drumbeat of hatred toward the enemy. Propaganda poured from radios, movie screens, and magazine pages. The Japanese were portrayed as subhuman monsters. The Germans were depicted as either goose-stepping automatons or sadistic killers. Newsreels showed the liberation of concentration camps, the twisted wreckage of bombed cities, the endless rows of white crosses in military cemeteries. To be German was to be evil. To sympathize with Germans was to betray every boy fighting overseas, every mother waiting at home, every value America claimed to defend. Yet even in this climate of absolute moral certainty, questions lingered in quieter corners. Were all Germans truly monsters? What about the German families who had immigrated to Wisconsin generations ago, who farmed the same land as everyone else, who sent their own sons to fight for America? What about the reports, whispered and quickly suppressed, of German soldiers who surrendered willingly, who seemed relieved to be out of the war? The debate between good Germans and Nazi monsters played out in newspaper editorials and church basements, never quite resolved, always uncomfortable. Catherine Mitchell had grown up in this town. She had attended Riverside Elementary herself, sat in the very classroom where she now taught. She had married young, to a farmer named Robert Mitchell, and when he died of pneumonia in 1938, she returned to teaching to support herself. She had no children of her own, but in 12 years of teaching, she had shaped hundreds of young minds. Parents trusted her. The school board respected her. She was known for being firm but fair, traditional but thoughtful, exactly the kind of teacher a small town valued. Her classroom reflected that reliability. Maps covered the walls, showing a world most of her students would never see. A globe sat on her desk, its surface worn from countless small hands, spinning it to find exotic locations. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of mathematics texts, grammar primers, and well-thumbed copies of American classics. Everything was orderly, predictable, safe. Until the autumn of 1944, when Catherine Mitchell encountered something that would shatter that safety forever. The prisoner of war camp had appeared outside Riverside in the spring of that year, almost overnight. One week, the old Morrison farm sat empty, its fields fallow after the family had moved to Chicago. The next week, army trucks rolled in, unloading lumber and barbed wire and guard towers. Within a month, a sprawling complex of barracks housed nearly 500 German prisoners, most captured in France after D-Day, others from the North African campaign years earlier. The town's reaction had been mixed. Some saw the camp as an affront, enemy soldiers living on American soil while American boys died overseas. Others saw economic opportunity. The prisoners were hired out as laborers to surrounding farms, filling the desperate shortage of workers. They harvested corn, milked cows, mended fences, and picked apples, all under guard, all paid pennies that went to the U.S. government. For struggling farmers, the labor was salvation. For everyone else, it was a daily reminder that the enemy walked among them. Catherine first saw the prisoners in late September, on a Saturday morning at Henderson's apple orchard. She had gone to buy fruit for canning when she noticed a group of men working in the distant rows, their uniforms unmistakable even at a distance. Guards with rifles stood watch, bored and smoking cigarettes. The prisoners worked steadily, efficiently, filling bushel baskets with red and golden apples. One of them, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses, was humming something that sounded like a German folk song. She watched them for a long time, her basket forgotten. These were the enemy. These were the men her former students were fighting, dying to stop. Yet watching them pick apples in the warm autumn sun, she saw something propaganda had never shown her. Humanity, weariness, young men far from home, doing ordinary work, probably thinking of their own families, their own fields, their own harvests. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. That night, Catherine could not sleep. She lay awake in her small bedroom, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a question that would not leave her alone. If these men were educated, if some had been teachers or engineers or scholars before the war, what were they thinking as they picked apples and hauled feed? What knowledge was locked inside their heads, unused, wasted? And more dangerously, what if her students could learn from them? The idea was insane. She knew that immediately. Bringing enemy soldiers into a classroom with American children during wartime was beyond controversial. It was potentially criminal. Yet the more she thought about it, the more sense it made from a purely educational standpoint. Her students had never met anyone from Europe. They had never heard a foreign language spoken by a native speaker. Their understanding of geography was limited to textbook maps and newsreel images of bombed cities. What if they could learn mathematics from a German engineer? Geography from someone who had actually walked the streets of Berlin or Munich, language from someone who spoke it as naturally as breathing? Catherine spent 2 weeks researching. She wrote letters to the War Department. She scoured the Geneva Convention rules governing prisoner treatment. She discovered, to her astonishment, that educational programs for POWs were not only legal, but encouraged. Camps across America had established schools where prisoners could learn English, study American history, even take college-level courses. The reasoning was coldly practical. Educated prisoners made better workers, caused fewer problems, and might become advocates for democracy when they returned home. But bringing prisoners into an American public school to teach American children? That was unprecedented. Catherine could find no record of it ever being attempted. Her internal struggle was immense. She was a patriot. Her uncle had fought in the First World War. Her cousin was currently serving in the Pacific. She had students whose brothers had died at Normandy, whose fathers were in German POW camps. How could she justify exposing children to the enemy? What if the prisoners spread propaganda? What if they frightened the students? What if she was making the biggest mistake of her life? Yet she kept returning to one fundamental belief. Education was the antidote to hatred. Ignorance bred fear. Understanding, even of one's enemies, bred wisdom. If America truly believed in freedom and democracy, if it truly claimed moral superiority over fascism, then it had to be confident enough to let its children see the enemy as human beings, not cartoon monsters. That confidence, Catherine believed, was what separated democracy from tyranny. In late October, she made an appointment with Captain James Bradley, the officer commanding the POW camp. He was a career Army man, skeptical and practical, with little patience for idealism. When Catherine explained her proposal, his first response was laughter. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you want me to let German prisoners into your classroom? To teach American kids? Have you lost your mind?" Catherine had prepared for this. She laid out her argument with the precision of a lawyer. The Geneva Convention allowed it. The prisoners would be heavily guarded. The educational value was undeniable. And most importantly, it would demonstrate American confidence and moral strength. "We're not afraid of our enemies, Captain," she said quietly. "We're strong enough to let our children see them as human beings who made terrible choices. That's the lesson democracy teaches." Captain Bradley was silent for a long moment. Then he surprised her. "I've got 3 prisoners who were teachers before the war. One was a mathematics professor, another taught languages. The third was a gymnasium instructor, what you'd call a high school teacher. They've been asking if they can teach classes in the camp. The men are bored out of their minds." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "If I allow this, and that's a big if, it'll be under strict conditions. Armed guards present at all times. No discussion of politics or military matters. First sign of trouble, it ends immediately." "I understand. And Mrs. Mitchell? When the town finds out, and they will find out, they're going to crucify you." Catherine met his eyes. "I know." The approval came through in early November. 3 prisoners were selected. Hans Müller, a 28-year-old former mathematics teacher from Stuttgart, Friedrich Weber, a 32-year-old languages instructor from Munich, and Otto Schneider, a 25-year-old who had taught geography and history in Cologne. All 3 had been captured in France, had clean disciplinary records, and spoke functional English. All 3 had families they desperately missed. Catherine told no one, not the school board, not the parents, not even the superintendent. She justified this silence by reasoning that official channels would have killed the program before it began. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. The first session was scheduled for November 9th, a Thursday morning. The night before, Catherine barely slept. She rehearsed what she would say to her students, how she would introduce the prisoners, how she would handle fear or hostility. She prayed, something she had not done seriously since her husband's death, asking for wisdom, for protection, for the courage to see this through. Thursday morning dawned cold and gray, frost covering the windows of Riverside Elementary. Her 32 students arrived as usual, stamping snow from their boots, chattering about homework and weekend plans. They ranged in age from 12 to 14, 8th graders preparing for high school. Catherine knew each of them intimately. She knew which ones had brothers in the service, which ones struggled with mathematics, which ones dreamed of leaving Riverside for bigger cities. At 9 o'clock, she stood before them and spoke words that would change everything. "Students, today we're going to have special guests. 3 men from the prisoner of war camp will be joining us to teach lessons in mathematics, languages, and geography. These men are German soldiers. They are our enemies in this war. But they are also teachers, and they have knowledge that can help you learn. I want you to listen respectfully, ask questions if you have them, and remember that education means understanding the whole world, not just the parts we're comfortable with." The classroom erupted in whispers. Catherine saw shock, confusion, and on a few faces, excitement. Before anyone could protest or flee, the door opened. 2 armed guards entered first, their rifles held across their chests. Then came the 3 prisoners. They wore their German uniforms, cleaned and pressed as best as the camp laundry allowed. Hans Müller was tall and thin, his face gaunt from years of inadequate rations. Friedrich Weber was stockier, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Otto Schneider was the youngest, his face still bearing traces of boyishness despite the weariness of war. The silence in the classroom was absolute. 32 students stared at 3 German soldiers. 3 German soldiers stared back at 32 American children. The guards positioned themselves at the back of the room, watching everything. And Catherine. Mitchell stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "Class, this is Mr. Muller, Mr. Weber, and Mr. Schneider. Gentlemen, these are my students." Hans Muller stepped forward. His English was heavily accented, but clear. "Good morning," he said softly. "It is an honor to be here. I was a teacher before the war. I've missed teaching very much." He paused, swallowing hard. "I have children myself, a son who would be your age. I've not seen him in 3 years." The atmosphere shifted slightly. These were not monsters. They were nervous men, standing in front of children, admitting vulnerability. Friedrich Weber spoke next, introducing himself, explaining that he had taught French and English in Munich, that he had always wanted to visit America, though not like this. Otto Schneider's voice cracked when he mentioned his younger sister, a teacher like Catherine, who he hoped was still alive. Then the teaching began. Hans Muller approached the chalkboard and wrote a complex mathematical equation. "Who can solve this?" he asked. When no one answered, he smiled gently and began to break it down, step by step, his teaching instincts taking over. Within minutes, students were raising their hands, asking questions, engaging despite themselves. Friedrich Weber taught them basic German phrases, pronouncing each word carefully, encouraging them to repeat. "Guten Tag, good day. Dankeschön, thank you very much." Some students giggled nervously. Others leaned forward, fascinated by the strange sounds. Otto Schneider unfolded a map of Europe and began describing German geography, not through the lens of war, but through the eyes of someone who had walked those streets, climbed those mountains, swum in those rivers. "The Rhine," he said wistfully, "is the most beautiful river you will ever see." Toward the end of the session, a student named Thomas Bergmann, whose brother was fighting in France, raised his hand. "Why did you fight for Hitler?" he asked, his voice shaking with emotion. The classroom went silent. The guards tensed. Catherine held her breath. Hans Muller looked at the boy for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with sorrow. "That is a question I ask myself every day," he said quietly. "I was told we were defending our country. I was told we had no choice. I believed what I was told until I saw what it truly meant. Now I am here, and my country is destroyed, and I cannot undo what has been done. All I can do is hope that you and your generation will be wiser than mine was." No propaganda could have prepared the students for that answer. No newsreel had shown them enemy soldiers expressing regret, doubt, humanity. As the prisoners left, accompanied by guards, several students sat in stunned silence. Others whispered urgently to each other. Catherine stood at the front of the room, exhausted and exhilarated, knowing that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. She had shown her students something true and complicated, something that did not fit neatly into the categories of good and evil that war demanded. She had no idea that within hours, the parents who had witnessed that scene would unleash a fury that would threaten to destroy everything she had built. The firestorm was coming, and it would test not just Catherine Mitchell's courage, but the moral fiber of an entire community, and ultimately, the wisdom of the very students she had dared to challenge. The telephone in Catherine Mitchell's small house began ringing at 11:30 that morning, barely 2 hours after the prisoners had left her classroom. She lifted the receiver to hear Margaret Hendricks, the mother of one of her students, her voice shaking with a fury so intense it seemed to vibrate through the phone line. "How dare you?" Margaret hissed. "How dare you bring those animals near my daughter? My husband is in a German prison camp right now, do you understand? He's probably being beaten and starved by men just like the ones you invited into your classroom. And you brought them here to teach our children." Catherine tried to speak, to explain, but Margaret was not finished. "You're a traitor, Catherine Mitchell. A traitor to every boy fighting overseas, to every mother who's lost a son, to everything this country stands for. By tonight, everyone in Riverside will know what you've done, and I promise you, you will pay for this." The line went dead. Catherine stood in her kitchen, the receiver still pressed to her ear, her hands trembling. She had expected anger, but the venom in Margaret's voice shocked her. This was a woman she had known for 15 years, whose daughter she had taught to read, who had brought casseroles after Robert died. Now that same woman had called her a traitor. The phone rang again, and again, and again. By noon, Catherine had stopped answering. Word spread through Riverside like fire through dry wheat. Margaret Hendricks called 5 friends before lunch. Those 5 called 20 more. By 1 o'clock, half the town knew that Catherine Mitchell had brought German prisoners into her classroom. By 2 o'clock, the story had grown teeth and claws, mutating into something far darker than reality. She had let the prisoners speak to children unsupervised. She had allowed them to spread Nazi propaganda. She had endangered the students, exposed them to dangerous criminals, possibly even spies. Some versions claimed she was romantically involved with one of the prisoners. Others suggested she was being paid by Germany to indoctrinate American youth. None of it was true. But truth had little currency in a town inflamed by fear and grief. The pastor of First Lutheran Church received a call demanding he condemn Catherine from the pulpit. The editor of the Riverside Weekly Sentinel received 36 calls before the afternoon was out, each one demanding front-page coverage of Catherine's betrayal. The police. Chief was asked if Catherine could be arrested for treason. The mayor was told in no uncertain terms that if he did not take action, he would lose the next election. By 5 o'clock, an emergency town hall meeting had been called for that very evening to be held at the high school auditorium. Catherine learned about the meeting when her neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, knocked on her door, her face grave. "Catherine, you need to know what's being said about you. They're calling for your head. I'd stay home tonight if I were you." But Catherine had no intention of staying home. If the town wanted to condemn her, they would do it to her face. The high school auditorium was packed by 7 o'clock that evening. Nearly 400 people crammed into seats designed for 300, with another 100 standing in the back and along the walls. The air was thick with anger, grief, and self-righteous fury. Gold Star mothers sat in the front rows, their faces carved from stone. Men too old for military service but young enough to feel guilty about it paced the aisles, looking for a target for their impotent rage. Women who had said goodbye to sons, husbands, and brothers clutched handkerchiefs, their eyes red from crying or blazing with anger. Mayor Thomas Whitmore called the meeting to order, but he barely had time to speak before the shouting began. "She brought Nazis into our school!" a voice cried from the back. "My son died at Omaha Beach, and she's teaching our children to sympathize with the enemy. It's treason, pure treason." The mayor banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order, but the crowd was a living thing now, feeding on its own outrage. Finally, he shouted loud enough to be heard. "Mrs. Mitchell is here. She has requested to speak. I think we owe her that much before we decide anything." The response was a chorus of boos and angry muttering, but eventually, the crowd settled into a hostile silence. Catherine stood and walked to the front of the auditorium, her back straight, her face composed despite the terror coursing through her veins. She climbed the steps to the stage and turned to face 400 of her neighbors, friends, and former students, all looking at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to naked hatred. She began to speak, her voice steady despite everything. "I understand your anger. I understand your fear. We are at war, and I brought men you consider enemies into proximity with your children. But I ask you to hear me out before you condemn me." "We don't need to hear anything," a man shouted. "You endangered our kids," Catherine continued as if she had not been interrupted. "Those prisoners are teachers. Before this war, they stood in classrooms just like mine, teaching mathematics and languages and geography to children just like yours. The Geneva Convention not only allows but encourages educational programs for prisoners of war. I confirmed this with the War Department. I coordinated. With Captain Bradley at the camp. Armed guards were present at all times. At no point were the children in danger." "That's not the point." Margaret Hendricks stood, her voice breaking. "The point is that those men represent everything we're fighting against. They wore the uniform of an army that's killed millions, that's destroying Europe, that's holding my husband prisoner right now. And you thought it was appropriate to let them teach our children?" The crowd erupted in agreement, voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger. Catherine waited for the noise to subside. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, but somehow more penetrating. Yes, they wore that uniform. Yes, they served in that army. But they are also human beings who have families, who have regrets, who are trying to survive a war they didn't start and can't stop. One of them told my students that he questions every day why he fought for Hitler. That is not propaganda. That is a man confronting his own moral failure. And I believe our children learned more from that honest moment of human doubt than from any number of propaganda posters telling them all Germans are monsters. "You're teaching our kids to sympathize with the enemy," another voice shouted. "No," Catherine said firmly. "I'm teaching them to think. I'm teaching them that the world is more complex than simple categories of good and evil. I'm teaching them that understanding your enemy does not mean excusing them, but it might mean preventing the next war." Robert Chambers stood then, a man of 60 whose son had died at Anzio 2 years earlier. His voice was thick with grief and rage. "My boy is dead, Mrs. Mitchell. He died fighting those bastards. And now you want me to believe that the men who killed him are just misunderstood, that they deserve our sympathy?" The crowd went silent, waiting for Catherine's response. She looked at Robert Chambers, at the unbearable pain etched into every line of his face, and felt her own eyes fill with tears. "Mr. Chambers, I am so deeply sorry for your loss. Your son was a hero, and nothing I say or do takes away from his sacrifice. But I have to ask you, what did he die for? Did he die so we could hate forever? Or did he die so that future generations might live in a world where education and understanding replace ignorance and hatred? Don't you dare use my son's death to justify what you've done," Chambers said, his voice breaking. The meeting continued for 2 more hours, growing uglier by the minute. Parents demanded Catherine's immediate dismissal. Some called for her arrest. The word treason was thrown around so frequently it lost all meaning. One woman suggested that Catherine should be sent to Germany since she loved Germans so much. A group of veterans stood together in the back, their faces hard, their arms crossed, a silent jury that had already delivered its verdict. The Riverside Weekly Sentinel's editor, Gerald Barnes, stood and announced that the next day's paper would feature a front-page editorial calling for Catherine's removal. "The people of Riverside have a right to know that their school has been compromised," he declared. "This is not about education. This is about loyalty. And Mrs. Mitchell has shown where her loyalties lie." Through it all, Catherine stood alone. Not a single person rose to defend her. Not one voice spoke in her support. The isolation was crushing, far worse than the anger. These were people she had known her entire life, people she had taught, helped, mourned with. And now they looked at her as if she were a stranger, or worse, an enemy. When the meeting finally ended near midnight, the school board announced an emergency session for the following afternoon. The superintendent, a cautious man named Harold Peterson, looked at Catherine with something between pity and frustration. "You've put me in an impossible position," he said quietly as the crowd dispersed. "Even if what you did was technically legal, you've turned this entire community against you. I don't know how I can keep you employed." Catherine drove home through empty streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. When she entered her house, she found a brick had been thrown through her front window. Glass glittered on the living room floor. Attached to the brick was a note written in angry capital letters, "Nazi lover, get out." The next morning brought no relief. The Riverside Weekly Sentinel's headline screamed across the front page, "Local teacher brings enemy soldiers into classroom. Parents demand action." The article was damning, filled with quotes from angry parents but containing not a single word from Catherine herself. The editorial beside it was even worse, comparing her actions to the behavior of collaborators in occupied France, suggesting that her judgment was so compromised she should never be allowed near children again. By 9 o'clock, a crowd had gathered outside the school, holding signs. "Protect our children." "Fire Mitchell." "No Nazis in our schools." Parents pulled their children out of class, refusing to allow them back until Catherine was gone. The school board met in closed session that afternoon, with Catherine waiting in a small office, essentially quarantined from the building she had worked in for 12 years. The legal pressure mounted quickly. The county prosecutor received calls demanding that Catherine be charged with something, anything. Child endangerment was suggested, providing aid to the enemy. Some even floated the idea of treason, though any lawyer knew such charges were absurd. Still, the FBI field office in Madison sent an agent to interview Catherine, a grim-faced man who asked pointed questions about her background, her political beliefs, her reasons for contacting the POW camp. "Are you now, or have you ever been a member of any organization sympathetic to the German government?" he asked. "No." "Have you received any compensation from German sources?" "Of course not." "Do you have any German ancestry?" "My grandparents came from Ireland and Scotland." The interview lasted 2 hours, and though the agent eventually concluded there was no evidence of actual treason or espionage, the fact that the FBI had been involved at all only fueled the town's conviction that Catherine was guilty of something. Her social isolation became complete. Friends stopped calling. Her church study group met without inviting her. At the grocery store, women she had known for decades turned away when they saw her coming. One former friend crossed the street rather than walk past her. Anonymous letters arrived daily, some threatening, others simply filled with disappointment and disgust. One read, "I trusted you with my daughter. I will never forgive you for betraying that trust." The prisoners themselves heard about the firestorm and were horrified. Captain Bradley visited Catherine to inform her that Hans Miller had asked to write a letter to the newspaper, taking full responsibility and explaining that Catherine had acted only out of educational motives. "I told him absolutely not," Bradley said. "That would only make things worse for you and for them. But I wanted you to know they feel terrible about this." The school board's emergency session stretched into the evening. Catherine was called in to face 5 board members, all of them people she had known for years, all of them now looking at her with expressions ranging from anger to profound disappointment. The board president, Walter Hughes, spoke first. "Catherine, we've reviewed the Geneva Convention provisions you cited. Technically, you broke no laws, but you violated every principle of common sense and community trust. You made a unilateral decision that has torn this town apart. Parents are pulling their children out of school. We've received threats against the school itself. The mayor is facing recall petitions. You've created a disaster." Catherine listened to each board member speak. Some were genuinely torn, acknowledging her years of exemplary service while condemning her judgment. Others were openly hostile, calling her decision arrogant and dangerous. When they finally allowed her to respond, Catherine stood and delivered the most important speech of her life. "I understand that I acted without permission. I understand that I have caused pain and anger, but I do not regret my decision, and I will not apologize for it. Education means exposing students to difficult truths, to complexity, to the reality that human beings are capable of both great evil and small kindnesses. Yes, those men served in Hitler's army. Yes, they bear responsibility for the choices they made. But they are also fathers and sons and teachers who have been humbled by defeat and captivity. My students learned more from 1 hour with them than from a year of propaganda posters. They learned that enemies are human beings, that war is not glorious, that the world is more complicated than we want it to be." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "You can fire me. You probably will. But I want you to know that I have letters from former students currently serving overseas. I've kept them private until now, but I want to read you one." She pulled a folded letter from her pocket, written by a young man named David Patterson, now serving in the army in France. She read aloud. "Mrs. Mitchell, we've been told to hate every German we see. And I do hate what their army has done. But yesterday I saw a German prisoner crying over a photograph of his children, and I thought about what you always told us, that every person has a story. That understanding doesn't mean weakness, that hatred blinds us to truth. I'm still fighting, and I'll fight until this war is over, but I won't let it turn me into someone who can't see the humanity in others, even my enemies. Thank you for teaching me that." The room was silent. Catherine folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket. "That young man understands what I was trying to teach. Not sympathy for the enemy, but the strength to remain human even in wartime. That is what America is supposed to stand for. That is what makes us different from the fascists. The board deliberated for another hour after Catherine left the room. When they called her back, their decision was clear in their faces even before Walter Hughes spoke. Mrs. Mitchell, effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending further investigation. We will reconvene in 1 week to make a final decision about your employment. Catherine nodded. She had expected nothing less. As she walked out of the school building that night, passing the protesters who still lingered, she felt the weight of what she had done settle fully on her shoulders. She had stood on principle, and it had cost her everything: her job, her reputation, her place in the community she had called home for 41 years. But as she drove through the dark streets of Riverside, she thought about her students, about the questions they had asked, about the look on Thomas Bergman's face when Hans Müller admitted his own doubt and regret. She thought about David Patterson's letter, about his determination to fight without losing his humanity. And she wondered if perhaps, despite everything, she had done something worth the cost. She would have her answer sooner than she expected, and it would come from the most unexpected source of all. While the adults of Riverside tore themselves apart with fury and recrimination, the 32 students who had actually sat in that classroom were doing something their parents had not anticipated. They were thinking. In the week between Catherine Mitchell's suspension and the school board's final decision, those students were processing what they had witnessed in a way that would ultimately prove far more mature than anything the adults had demonstrated. Sarah Hendricks, daughter of the woman who had made that first furious phone call, sat at her kitchen table 3 days after the town hall meeting, her mathematics homework spread before her. Her mother was in the living room, still raging to neighbors about Catherine's betrayal. But Sarah could not stop thinking about Hans Müller standing at the chalkboard, his thin hands carefully working through an algebraic equation, his patience with students who struggled, his gentle correction when someone made a mistake. He had taught exactly the way Mrs. Mitchell taught, with clarity and kindness. The only difference was his accent and his uniform. At school, now taught by a substitute teacher who seemed terrified of saying anything controversial, the students gathered in small groups during recess and lunch, speaking in hushed voices about what had happened. Thomas Bergman, whose brother was fighting in France, had been quiet since that day, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, during lunch on the third day, he spoke. "My parents are furious at Mrs. Mitchell," he said slowly, picking at his sandwich. "They say she disrespected every soldier fighting overseas. But I keep thinking about what Mr. Müller said when I asked him why he fought for Hitler. He looked so sad, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. That wasn't propaganda. That was just honest." Mary Patterson, whose brother David was the one who had written the letter Catherine had read to the school board, nodded. "My brother wrote something similar in his letters. He said the hardest part of war isn't hating the enemy. It's remembering they're human and having to fight them anyway. Mrs. Mitchell was trying to teach us what David learned the hard way." The conversations continued in whispers and careful exchanges, students comparing notes on what they had heard, what they had felt, what they had learned. And slowly, carefully, a consensus emerged among them. The adults were wrong. Not wrong to be angry, perhaps, not wrong to be afraid, but wrong in their conclusion that Catherine Mitchell had betrayed them. She had done something difficult and brave, and she was being destroyed for it. The idea to defend her started with the oldest students, 14-year-olds who would be entering high school the following year. James Müller, no relation to the German prisoner, was the first to suggest it openly. "We should write letters to the newspaper," he said during a secret gathering in the school library. "All of us, telling what actually happened, because the paper is printing lies and nobody's talking to us." "Our parents will kill us," someone said nervously. "Maybe," James acknowledged, "but Mrs. Mitchell is going to lose her job because of what happened in our classroom. Don't we owe her the truth?" The response was not unanimous. Several students were genuinely torn, caught between loyalty to their teacher and fear of their parents' rage. Others, particularly those whose families had lost men in the war, struggled with the moral complexity of defending someone the entire town had condemned. But slowly, over the course of several clandestine meetings held in barns, behind the school and in the woods outside town, a core group of 18 students made a decision. They would speak up, regardless of the consequences. What they planned was methodical and sophisticated beyond their years. First, each student would write an individual letter to the Riverside Weekly Sentinel, describing what they had actually experienced in that classroom. No exaggeration, no emotional appeals, just facts. What was taught, what was said, what they learned. Second, they would create a petition supporting Catherine Mitchell and circulate it among all the students in the school. Third, and most daringly, they would attend the final school board meeting and ask to testify. The letter-writing campaign began immediately. Sarah Hendricks wrote hers in her bedroom late at night by flashlight, afraid her mother would discover her. Her letter was careful and precise. My name is Sarah Hendricks. I am 14 years old, and I was in Mrs. Mitchell's classroom when the German prisoners visited. I want to tell you what actually happened, because what is being reported is not accurate. Mr. Muller taught us mathematics. He showed us how to solve problems we had struggled with all year. He was patient and kind. He told us about his son in Germany, who he has not seen in 3 years. He never mentioned Hitler. He never talked about the war, except when Thomas Bergman asked him directly why he fought. His answer was honest and sad. He said he regretted his choices. That is not propaganda. That is a man admitting he was wrong. I learned more from that 1 hour than from any propaganda poster. I learned that education means seeing the world as it really is, not as we wish it to be. Thomas Bergman's letter was even more powerful because of his family's situation. My name is Thomas Bergman. My older brother Robert is currently fighting in France. My family has every reason to hate Germans. But I want to tell you that meeting those prisoners did not make me sympathize with the enemy. It made me understand why this war matters. We are not fighting because Germans are monsters. We are fighting because good people made terrible choices out of fear and propaganda. If we learn to recognize that, maybe we can prevent it from happening again. My brother is risking his life for that future. Mrs. Mitchell is being destroyed for trying to teach us how to build it. One by one, the letters were mailed to the newspaper. Gerald Barnes, the editor, received the first one with skepticism, assuming it was written by an adult posing as a student. But when the second, third, and 10th letter arrived, all in different handwriting, all signed with names he recognized, all expressing similar sentiments in distinctly teenage voices, he realized something. Unprecedented was happening. The students themselves were rebelling against their parents' fury. He published the first letter on Thursday, 4 days after Catherine's suspension. By Friday, 3 more had appeared. By Monday, the newspaper had received 22 letters from students, and Barnes made the controversial decision to run a full-page special section titled "Students Speak: What Really Happened in Mrs. Mitchell's Classroom." The impact was immediate and profound. Parents who had been certain their children were endangered suddenly found themselves confronted with their own children's words, calmly and rationally explaining that they had not been harmed, brainwashed, or traumatized. They had been educated. Margaret Hendricks discovered her daughter's letter when a neighbor brought over the newspaper, her face troubled. "Margaret, did you know Sarah wrote this?" Margaret read her daughter's words with mounting disbelief, then climbed the stairs to Sarah's bedroom. "Did you write this?" she demanded, holding up the paper. Sarah looked up from her homework, her face calm but her hands shaking. "Yes." "How could you? After what that woman did? After what I've been through worrying about your father?" "Mom, I wrote the truth. That's all. The truth about what happened in that classroom. If you're angry at the truth, maybe you should ask yourself why." It was a conversation happening in households across Riverside. Children, usually silent and obedient, were suddenly challenging their parents' narrative, not with disrespect, but with facts and moral clarity that many adults found deeply uncomfortable. The petition arrived at the school board office on Tuesday morning, delivered by James Muller and Mary Patterson. It contained the signatures of 28 of the 32 students who had been in Catherine's classroom that day, along with statements from each explaining why they supported their teacher. The 4 who did not sign were not opposed, they simply had not been present when the petition circulated. The document was remarkable in its formality and thoughtfulness, clearly drafted by young people who understood they were participating in something important. The petition read, "We, the undersigned students of Riverside Elementary School, hereby state that Mrs. Catherine Mitchell acted in good faith and educational interest when she arranged for German prisoners of war to visit our classroom. We were not endangered, traumatized, or exposed to propaganda. We were taught mathematics, language, and geography by qualified teachers who happened to be prisoners. We learned that education means engaging with difficult truths and complex realities. We believe Mrs. Mitchell should be reinstated immediately, and we ask the school board to recognize that the students who were actually present have a right to be heard in this matter." The school board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after Catherine's suspension. The auditorium was once again packed, but this time the crowd included a significant new element: students. More than 40 teenagers filed in and took seats together in the center section, their presence unexpected and unsettling. Parents whispered urgently, trying to figure out what their children were doing there. Some attempted to remove their children, but the students politely refused to leave. Walter Hughes called the meeting to order, announced that the board had reviewed all available evidence and would make their final decision after hearing any last testimony. "We'll take comments from community members first," he began. "Mr. Hughes," James Muller stood, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "We respectfully request that the students be allowed to speak. This decision is about what happened in our classroom. We were there. We should be heard." The auditorium erupted in conversation. Parents objected. The board members conferred. Finally, Hughes banged his gavel. "The students have a point. We'll hear from 5 student representatives, 5 minutes each. Keep it relevant and respectful." What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of moral courage that Riverside had ever witnessed. One by one, students stood and testified, not with childish emotion, but with clear-eyed rationality that made many adults deeply uncomfortable. Mary Patterson spoke first. "My brother David is fighting in France right now. He wrote to Mrs. Mitchell and told her that he's grateful she taught him to see enemies as human beings, because it helps him stay human himself. He said hatred makes soldiers cruel, but understanding makes them strong. Mrs. Mitchell taught us what David is living. If you fire her, you're saying that understanding is dangerous. My brother would disagree." Thomas Bergman was next. His voice shook, but his words were clear. "When I asked Mr. Muller why he fought for Hitler, I wanted him to have an excuse. I wanted him to say he had no choice, that he didn't know what was happening. But he didn't. He said he asks himself that question every day. He said he believed lies until he saw the truth, and now it's too late. That answer scared me more than any propaganda poster because it was real. It showed me how easy it is for good people to make terrible choices. That's what Mrs. Mitchell wanted us to learn, not to sympathize with the enemy, but to understand how ordinary people become enemies." Sarah Hendricks stood, and her mother gasped audibly from 3 rows back. "I know my mother is angry at Mrs. Mitchell. I know she thinks Mrs. Mitchell disrespected my father, who is a prisoner in Germany right now. But I think Mrs. Mitchell honored my father by showing us that prisoners deserve to be treated with dignity. If we want the Germans to treat American prisoners humanely, shouldn't we demonstrate that standard ourselves? Mrs. Mitchell showed us what American values actually mean, not just what they claim to mean." The 4th student was Elizabeth Warner, whose older brother had died at Normandy 6 months earlier. When she stood, the entire auditorium fell silent. Everyone knew her family's loss. If anyone had the right to condemn Catherine Mitchell, it was this girl. "My brother died in France," Elizabeth began, her voice soft but audible in the profound silence. "My family has been destroyed by that loss. My mother cries every night. My father doesn't speak anymore. We have a gold star flag in our window, and every time I see it, I feel like I can't breathe. So believe me when I say I understand the anger toward Mrs. Mitchell." She paused, tears visible in her eyes, but her voice remaining steady. "But I've been thinking about what my brother died for. He didn't die so we could hate forever. He died so we could be free. Free to think, free to learn, free to make our own decisions about right and wrong. Mrs. Mitchell gave us that freedom. She trusted us to handle a difficult truth. She believed we were strong enough to meet the enemy face to face and still think clearly. My brother fought so we could live in a country where teachers can do that. If you fire Mrs. Mitchell for trusting us, then you're saying my brother died for nothing. You're saying freedom only matters when it's comfortable." The silence that followed Elizabeth's testimony was absolute. Several parents were crying. Others sat with their heads bowed. Margaret Hendricks stared at her daughter with an expression of shock and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The fifth student, Robert Chen, whose family had immigrated from China and who often felt like an outsider in overwhelmingly white Riverside, spoke last. "I learned something important that day. I learned that America's strength isn't in hating our enemies better than they hate us. It's in being confident enough to treat even our enemies fairly. The Germans put people in camps because they were afraid of difference. We put Germans in camps too, but we treat them humanly because we're not afraid. That difference matters. Mrs. Mitchell showed us why it matters. She showed us that America's power comes from its values, not just its weapons." When the students finished, Walter Hughes cleared his throat roughly. "Thank you. You've given us much to consider." He looked out at the crowd of adults, many of whom now seemed uncertain, their righteous fury complicated by their own children's testimony. "We'll deliberate and announce our decision within the hour." The board retreated to a private room. The auditorium buzzed with conversation, but the tone had shifted dramatically. Parents who had been calling for Catherine's head now found themselves confronted with an uncomfortable question. Were their children wiser than they were? Margaret Hendricks approached her daughter, her face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Sarah, you should have told me you were going to do this." "Would you have let me?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret had no answer. Across the auditorium, similar conversations were happening. Parents were being forced to see the situation through their children's eyes, and what they saw was morally complex in ways they had refused to acknowledge. The students had not been brainwashed, they had not been endangered, they had been challenged, and they had risen to that challenge with more maturity than most adults had shown. Catherine Mitchell sat in a small office adjacent to the auditorium, listening to the muffled sounds of the meeting through the door. When the students had begun to testify, a teacher who supported her had rushed to tell her what was happening. Catherine had sat down heavily, overcome with emotion. Her students, the young people she had taught and nurtured and believed in, were fighting for her when every adult had abandoned her. When the school board returned, after 45 minutes of heated deliberation, Walter Hughes's face was unreadable. The auditorium fell silent as he approached the microphone. "The board has reached a decision," he began. "This has been one of the most difficult situations we've ever faced. Mrs. Mitchell's actions were controversial, unauthorized, and have caused significant community discord. However, after hearing testimony from the students themselves, the people who were actually present and actually affected by her decision, we cannot in good conscience conclude that she acted maliciously or harmfully." The auditorium erupted in both cheers and angry shouts. Hughes banged his gavel repeatedly. "Let me finish. Mrs. Mitchell will be reinstated, effective immediately with full pay restored. However, she will be placed on probation for 1 year. Any future controversial decisions must be approved by this board in advance, and we will be implementing new policies regarding classroom visitors and educational programs." The decision satisfied no one completely, but it was enough. Catherine Mitchell would keep her job. The students had saved her. As the crowd dispersed, many still angry but others thoughtful and subdued, the students gathered around Catherine in the hallway. She embraced them, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak. These children had done what she had hoped education would do. They had thought for themselves. They had stood up for principle despite enormous pressure. They had been braver than any adult in Riverside. Sarah Hendricks approached cautiously, aware that her mother was watching from across the hall. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly, "thank you for trusting us enough to show us the truth, even when it was hard." Catherine pulled her into a hug. Over Sarah's shoulder, she saw Margaret Hendricks, her face still troubled but no longer angry, just watching her daughter with an expression of confused pride. The moral transformation of Riverside had begun, not with adult wisdom or political speeches, but with the simple clarity of young people who had been given a glimpse of complexity and had responded with grace and courage. In the arithmetic of change, it turned out that students could teach lessons that adults desperately needed to learn. The reinstatement of Catherine Mitchell did not heal Riverside overnight. The school board's decision, delivered on that tense Wednesday evening, was more truce than victory. She would return to her classroom, but the scars of the conflict would mark the community for years to come. Some wounds would eventually close. Others would remain open, tender reminders that principle always carries a price. The program with the German prisoners continued, though under conditions so strict they bordered on absurd. Captain Bradley, perhaps relieved that the controversy had not shut down the initiative entirely, agreed to even more stringent supervision. 4 armed guards now accompanied the 3 prisoners instead of 2. A school board member attended every session, sitting in the back with a notepad, recording everything said. Parents were invited to observe, though few took up the offer, their absence speaking louder than their presence ever could. And every word spoken by the prisoners was reviewed in advance, every lesson plan approved by a committee that included a military chaplain, a school administrator, and a representative from the local veterans organization. Despite these constraints, the educational exchange flourished in ways that surprised even Catherine. Hans Miller returned to teaching mathematics with a passion that had been dormant for years. He introduced the students to geometric proofs, to algebraic concepts beyond their grade level, explaining complex ideas with clarity born of genuine love for his subject. Mathematics, he told them one afternoon, his accent still thick but his English improving, is the one language that never lies. 2 plus 2 is 4 in Germany, in America, in China, everywhere. If only people could be so reliable. Friedrich Weber taught them German with patience and humor, drilling pronunciation until they could properly say Guten Tag and Wie geht es Ihnen. He brought in German folk songs, teaching them the melodies and explaining the cultural context. One song, Die Gedanken sind frei, which meant thoughts are free, became a classroom favorite. The irony was not lost on anyone that prisoners were teaching American children a song about freedom of thought. This song, Friedrich explained, was sung by people imprisoned for their beliefs. It reminds us that even when our bodies are not free, our minds can be. Otto Schneider's geography lessons transformed the way students understood Europe. He did not teach from textbooks filled with political boundaries and capital cities. He taught from memory, describing the Rhine River at sunset, the way the Alps looked when snow first touched their peaks, the narrow streets of Cologne where he had grown up. He brought Europe alive in a way no map ever could. Geography, he said, is not about lines on paper. It is about people and places, about how land shapes culture and culture shapes land. When you understand geography, you understand why people think the way they do. But the most profound lessons came not from the curriculum, but from the unscripted moments. The day Hans Muller's voice broke when he mentioned that his son would be 9 years old now, and he had missed 3 birthdays. The afternoon, Friedrich Weber showed them a battered photograph of his wife and daughter, the edges worn from handling, and admitted he did not know if they had survived the bombing of Munich. The moment Otto Schneider described watching American planes drop bombs on his city and understanding for the first time that his nation was going to lose, that everything he had believed was built on lies. These moments taught lessons no textbook contained. They taught that war destroys everyone it touches. That certainty is often the enemy of truth. That admitting you were wrong requires more courage than fighting ever does. The prisoners themselves underwent a transformation through teaching. For years they had been defined solely by their status as captives, their days measured out in labor and waiting, their humanity reduced to a number on a camp roster. Teaching returned something essential to them: dignity, purpose. The knowledge that even in captivity they could contribute something valuable. Hans Muller later wrote in his diary, which was preserved and eventually donated to a war museum, "For 1 hour each week, I am not a prisoner. I am a teacher again. I'm useful. I'm human." The students noticed this transformation. Mary Patterson wrote in an essay assigned by Catherine, "When Mr. Muller teaches, he stands straighter. He smiles. The sadness that usually fills his eyes disappears for a little while. I think teaching reminds him of who he was before the war. Maybe it reminds him of who he can be after the war." Friendships formed, tentative at first, then stronger as weeks passed. Thomas Bergman began staying after class to ask Hans Mueller about German literature, fascinated by the descriptions of writers he had never heard of. Sarah Hendricks discovered a gift for languages under Friedrich Weber's instruction, her pronunciation so good that he praised her effusively. "You have the ear," he told her. "You could be a translator someday." Elizabeth Warner, the girl whose brother had died at Normandy, found unexpected comfort in conversations with Otto Schneider, who listened as she talked about her grief and responded with his own, creating a bridge of shared loss that transcended nationality. The remainder of the school year passed in an uneasy equilibrium. The town remained divided. Some parents, humbled by their children's testimony, apologized to Catherine in private, awkward encounters filled with halting admissions that perhaps they had been too quick to judge. Margaret Hendricks appeared at Catherine's door one Sunday afternoon, her face drawn and tired. "I don't know if I agree with what you did," she said quietly, "but my daughter wrote something yesterday. She said you taught her to think, not what to think. I've been thinking about that." It was not quite an apology, but it was movement toward reconciliation. Others never forgave. Robert Chambers, the man whose son had died at Anzio, refused to speak to Catherine for the rest of his life. He would cross the street when he saw her coming, his grief so absolute that it could not make room for complexity or nuance. Catherine understood. Some wounds were too deep to heal. The program lasted until May of 1945, when Germany's surrender made continued sessions unnecessary. By then, the three prisoners had taught over 30 hours of material, covering mathematics through calculus, conversational German, European geography, music theory, and even philosophy. The students had learned more than facts. They had learned empathy, critical thinking, and the courage to question comfortable narratives. When the war ended and repatriation began, the three prisoners returned to a Germany that barely existed. Hans Müller discovered his wife and son alive, but living in the ruins of Stuttgart, their home destroyed, their city a landscape of rubble. Friedrich Weber found his family scattered across occupied zones, his wife in the British sector, his daughter missing for months before being found in a displaced persons camp. Otto Schneider returned to Cologne to discover that both his parents had died in the final months of the war, his childhood home obliterated by bombs. Yet all three maintained correspondence with Catherine Mitchell and several of her students. The letters, preserved in Catherine's papers, reveal the lasting impact of those classroom sessions. Hans Müller wrote in 1947, "Teaching your students reminded me that education is the only path forward. Germany must rebuild not just its buildings, but its soul. I have returned to teaching, working in a school that meets in a church basement, because our school building is destroyed. When I feel despair, I think of your students' faces, their curiosity, their willingness to see me as a human being. That gives me hope." In 1952, Friedrich Weber made the journey back to Riverside, Wisconsin, paying his own way to visit the town where he had once been a prisoner. He stayed with Catherine Mitchell, who had by then retired from teaching, and spoke to a new generation of students about the war, about his experiences, about the importance of education in preventing future conflicts. The visit was covered by newspapers across Wisconsin, framed as a story of reconciliation and hope. Friedrich told reporters, "Mrs. Mitchell took a risk that could have destroyed her. She did it because she believed education was more powerful than hatred. She was right." The students whose lives were shaped by that experience carried its lessons into remarkable futures. Mary Patterson became a teacher herself, specializing in foreign languages, eventually serving as a translator for the State Department during the Cold War. She credited Catherine Mitchell with showing her that language was not just communication, but understanding, a bridge across the chasms that divided people. Thomas Bergman became a professor of history, writing extensively about World War II with a nuance and humanity rare in early Cold War scholarship. His work challenged simplistic narratives of good versus evil, insisting on the complexity of human choice even in extreme circumstances. Sarah Hendricks pursued diplomacy, serving in the U.S. Foreign Service and eventually becoming an ambassador. In her confirmation hearings, she spoke about the day she met German prisoners in her 8th grade classroom, describing it as the moment she understood that peace required more courage than war. Elizabeth Warner, whose brother's death had given her testimony such power, became a peace advocate, working with international organizations to promote dialogue and reconciliation in post-conflict societies. She often told the story of Catherine Mitchell, using it as an example of moral courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. Catherine Mitchell herself lived until 1983, dying at the age of 80. Her career after the controversy was complicated. Some school districts blacklisted her, viewing her as too radical, too willing to challenge community norms. Others celebrated her, inviting her to speak at teacher conferences, to write about her experiences, to train new teachers in methods that encouraged critical thinking over rote learning. In 1976, during America's bicentennial, she was honored by the National Education Association as an education pioneer, recognized for demonstrating that good teaching sometimes required taking risks that made everyone uncomfortable. Historians now view Catherine Mitchell's experiment as part of a broader, largely forgotten chapter of World War II. The United States held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war on American soil between 1943 and 1946. Under the Geneva Convention, these prisoners were entitled to humane treatment, including educational opportunities. Over 600 POW camps across America established schools, libraries, and cultural programs. Prisoners could study English, mathematics, science, even earn college credits through correspondence courses. Some camps had orchestras, theater groups, and sports leagues. Yet, programs like Catherine's, where prisoners interacted directly with American civilians, especially children, were extremely rare. Most communities wanted nothing to do with enemy soldiers. The handful of documented cases where similar exchanges occurred usually happened quietly, without publicity, precisely because communities knew such programs would be controversial. Catherine's mistake, if it can be called that, was not in doing it, but in doing it openly, honestly, believing that transparency would protect her. Instead, transparency made her vulnerable. The fundamental question her story raises remains relevant. Can education overcome hatred even during war? Catherine Mitchell believed the answer was yes. Her students proved her right. The adults of Riverside, in their fury and fear, proved how difficult that answer was to accept. The mathematics of hatred versus understanding is stark and unforgiving. Hatred is easy. It requires no thought, no nuance, no moral courage. It provides clear categories: us and them, good and evil, right and wrong. Understanding is hard. It demands intellectual effort, moral complexity, the willingness to acknowledge that people you oppose are still people. During wartime, when emotions run highest and stakes feel absolute, choosing understanding over hatred feels like betrayal. Yet Catherine Mitchell understood something crucial. Hatred might win battles, but only understanding could win peace. If the next generation learned only to hate, they would simply fight the same wars over and over. If they learned to understand, to see complexity, to recognize humanity even in enemies, they might break the cycle. Her students learned lessons no textbook could teach. They learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. They learned that moral clarity sometimes comes from unlikely sources, that children can see truth adults miss, that standing alone for principle is the price of integrity. They learned that the enemy is not a category, but individual human beings who made choices, good and bad, just as everyone does. Most importantly, they learned that education is not indoctrination. It is not about telling students what to think. It is about teaching them how to think, giving them tools to navigate moral complexity, trusting them to reach their own conclusions. Catherine Mitchell trusted her students in a way their parents did not. That trust was rewarded. The courage required to humanize the enemy during wartime cannot be overstated. Every instinct, every social pressure, every propaganda poster screamed at Catherine Mitchell to hate, to treat enemies as enemies, to maintain the clear moral boundaries that war demands, choosing instead to see prisoners as teachers, as fathers, as human beings capable of both terrible choices and small kindnesses, required a kind of courage that has nothing to do with physical bravery. It was the courage of moral conviction maintained against overwhelming opposition. Why does this story matter today? Because the cycle of dehumanization Catherine Mitchell challenged continues in every conflict. Whether the enemy is defined by nationality, religion, ideology, or politics, the pattern repeats. The other side becomes monsters. Our side becomes heroes. Complexity disappears. And the next generation inherits not wisdom, but hatred. Catherine Mitchell's story offers an alternative. It suggests that even in the darkest times, even when the world demands hatred, educators can choose understanding. Communities can choose complexity. Students can choose to think rather than simply accept. In the spring of 2004, nearly 60 years after that controversial classroom session, the surviving students of Catherine Mitchell's class held a reunion in Riverside. Only 15 were still living, all now in their 70s. They gathered in the same elementary school building, now modernized but still recognizable. They stood in Catherine's old classroom, now used for computer instruction, and remembered. Mary Patterson, age 73, former ambassador, spoke for all of them. Mrs. Mitchell showed us something precious that day. She showed us that America's strength is not in hating better than our enemies. It is in being confident enough to remain decent even when decency is difficult. Hans Müller and Friedrich Weber and Otto Schneider were our enemies. But they were also teachers who loved their subject, fathers who missed their children, human beings who had made terrible mistakes and knew it. Understanding that did not make us weak, it made us wise. Sarah Hendricks, by then a retired diplomat, added quietly. My mother never fully forgave Mrs. Mitchell, but years later, after my father came home from his POW camp, he told me something. He said the German guards who treated him humanely saved his sanity. The ones who saw him as human rather than enemy gave him hope. Mrs. Mitchell was trying to teach us to be like those guards, to be the kind of people who remain human even in war. I think my father understood that better than my mother ever could. As the elderly former students departed that day, walking slowly through the spring sunshine, they carried with them the memory of a teacher who had valued truth over comfort, education over propaganda, understanding over hatred. And they carried the knowledge that when the entire adult world demanded they conform to hatred, they had chosen something harder and better. Catherine Mitchell had taught them mathematics and grammar and history, but her greatest lesson was this, that standing for principle when everyone opposes you is not betrayal. It is citizenship in its highest form. And sometimes the students must teach the teachers, the children must guide the adults, because wisdom does not always come with age. In a small cemetery outside Riverside, Catherine Mitchell's headstone bears a simple inscription chosen by her former students. She taught us to think. No greater epitaph exists for a teacher. No greater legacy remains for a life dedicated to education in its truest form. The classroom door that opened on that November morning in 1944 revealed more than German prisoners. It revealed a path forward through hatred toward understanding, through certainty toward complexity, through war toward peace. Catherine Mitchell had the courage to open that door. Her students had the wisdom to walk through it, and the world, whether it knew it or not, was better for their courage.